When I sat down to write a video about whatever the earliest comic in history was, I expected to, find some cave paintings that I could technically argue were comics, because there were a bunch of different cave painting images that occurred one after the other in the story, and then I thought maybe I would get into the Bayeux Tapestry. I don't know if the Bayeux Tapestry is taught much outside of England. Presumably in France, or at least Normandy, they teach about the Bayeux Tapestry. I'm not sure. But the second I sat down to think about it for even a second, I realised that the entire concept of a comic is completely ridiculous. I tried to come up with a definition of a comic that fits with societal standards about what we call a comic, but then I realised there are no societal standards about what we call a comic, okay? Because it's purely based off vibes, effectively. So allow me to read off several versions of the phrase, "Would you consider this a comic?" to illustrate my point. Allow me to introduce this picture to you. Would you say this is a comic? Yes, of course you would. Now let me introduce this to you. This is a one-square comic strip, and while some may have their doubts, most would still call this a comic of sorts. But hang on a second. If one square is all that's required to count as a comic, then surely anything counts as a comic. This is a one-square image that tells a story. Is this a comic? This is the earliest known cave painting. Is this a comic? No. You wouldn't say that either of these are a comic, but you would say that this is a comic. On the surface, these two images are both the same thing. Pictures drawn to tell a story. Yet most people will happily call this a comic, and not this. Why? Some may say that this is a comic because it is intended to be humorous, or because it was published in a newspaper. But what if I changed both those things? What if I found a picture that was intended to be humorous, and a comic that was never published in a newspaper? Maybe it was never published at all, just written down on somebody's paper at home. Would that really change anything? Would you still not refer to that comic as a comic? If this image had never ever been published or published outside of a newspaper, you wouldn't say that it wasn't a comic. And if this image had been published in a newspaper, would you say that it was a comic? There is no generally agreed upon definition of a comic, but after a bit of thinking, I came to my own opinion about that. In my opinion, the thing that makes something a comic is the art style. So for instance, take this image. Now let's imagine this image in a live action, or better yet, 3D animation. If you saw that picture out of context, or that picture out of context, would you recognise it, either of them, as a comic? No, but you would recognise this as a comic. Why? This leads me to conclude that an art style is one of the key things that defines something as a comic. Some of you may be disagreeing with me. You may be saying that if I took a bunch of images in chronological order, then it doesn't matter what the art style is. If they tell a story, if they're funny, they're a comic. But then let me ask you this, what's the difference between that and a picture book? A picture book, absolutely no words in it, just one picture per page, is still a series of images told in chronological order to tell a story. But that's not a comic, is it? You wouldn't look at a 3-year-old toddler reading a book with no words in it and say, oh yeah, that toddler's reading a comic, would you? So what's the difference between a picture book and a comic? Well, I would argue that a comic has multiple squares on a page, versus a picture book, which only has one square on a page. So perhaps the definition of a comic is something that fits a certain art style that also has multiple squares on a page? So fine, we've got a definition centering around the art style here, but the problem is you can't center a definition around an art style because there's no rigid line between one art style and another. And so when I went to the Wikipedia list of comics before 1900, well, it became impossible to tell which were comics and which weren't. I mean, there are some that are on the fence, like I'm going to put the images on screen now. Do you think these are comics? Do you not? It appears we're going to have to change tactics here. It's become clear to me that an art style can't be used to define something because an art style can't even be defined in itself. So let's change tactics. Do you remember how I decried the idiots who thought that a comic was several images all telling a story in chronological order? Yeah, well now I am one of those idiots because that is a definition that makes sense and is easier to categorize than the other one, so let's go with that one, I guess. So the first cave painting appears to be a series of pictures of pigs. They don't appear to be telling a story at all. Apparently the first known cave painting that depicts something in motion is 31,000 years ago, of a rhino in France that appears to be in motion. Then apparently the Egyptians and later the Romans had comics, probably on papyrus and on the side of walls, I would imagine. I say I would imagine because I couldn't find any pictures of them, unfortunately. But unless you could say they're a comic, then we have tapestries like the Bayeux Tapestry I mentioned earlier. And finally, in 1493, we have the first known use of text bubbles, which is the thing you see commonly in comics. So Perhaps you could say that may have been one of the first known comics if you think it needs to have a text bubble to be a comic. But either way, I've given the facts to you, and you can decide what you think is a comic.